All right. Well, I'd like to welcome everybody to the latest of the Arts and Planning Division's professional development series. This is Best Practices for Arts Resilience. Um, a couple of quick ground rule setting. We're going to start with some intros. We've got a couple of presentations. After the presentations, we'll have some plenty of time for questions. If you have questions during the presentations, please put them in the chat. I see Julie will be monitoring the chat for questions. Um, and then after the presentations are finished, you can either put your questions in the chat or you can raise your hand and we will address the questions in the order in which they were received. So if you have a question in the chat, I will read it out. If your hand is raised, I will call on you and you can ask your question in this space. So again, thank you all for attending. My name is Ethan Ellestad. I am a board member of the American Planning Association's Arts and Planning Division. I'm also the policy chair of the board. In my day job, I'm the executive director of the Music and Culture Coalition of New Orleans, which is an advocacy-based nonprofit, not surprisingly, in New Orleans, Louisiana. We work at the intersection of cultural policy and social justice. So a lot of the work that we do is based around planning work, it's zoning, it's noise ordinance, but it's also dealing with issues like affordable housing. And relevant to this particular conversation, during COVID and then subsequent disasters, we've been leaning a lot into disaster relief ourselves, doing small relief grants and supporting and connecting people with supporting services here because we found it's an ongoing and growing need for folks that may not have otherwise access to assistance. So we deal a lot with folks like street performers, part-time visual artists, et cetera, making sure that they have ways that they can connect that they may not have otherwise been able to. I have two fantastic presenters today, so my job is going to be pretty easy. I will introduce them and then we will go into their presentations. Um, First is Dr. Nana Kaneko, who is the Heritage Emergency National Task Force Acting Coordinator in FEMA's Office of Environmental Planning and Historic Preservation. HENTF is a public-private partnership sponsored by FEMA's OEHP and the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative, over 60 culture and emergency management related nonprofit organizations and federal agencies working to protect our nation's cultural heritage from the damaging effects of natural disasters and other emergencies. As acting coordinator, Nana raises awareness within FEMA and other federal agencies of the assistance HENTF can provide to both cultural institutions and the public, and leverages HENTF member expertise to provide technical assistance to cultural institutions and arts organizations following disasters. Prior to this position, Nana was the Mellon ACLS Public Fellow at the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative as Program Manager for Cultural Disaster Analysis. She received her Ph.D. in ethnomusicology from UC Riverside in 2017. Thank you for being with us. Our other presenter is Ruby Lopez Harper, Executive Director of CERF Plus, has a track record as a detail-oriented professional possessing over 15 years of experience in optimizing productivity, efficiency, and service quality across various environments. Her ability to collaborate with leadership and department heads at over 6 years in various roles at the American for Arts ensured alignment between organizational goals while actively monitoring and reporting to the CEO. She's an adjunct professor at George Mason University, where she teaches the course Arts and Community Engagement. She previously worked at the Greater Columbus, Ohio Arts Council. Thank you for being here as well. To kick things off, I'm going to send it over to Nana Kaneko to start with her presentation.
All right, thank you, Ethan, and thank you to the Arts and Planning Division of APA for this invitation. I'm looking forward to speaking today. And let's see if my screen share will work, hopefully. It says it's loading, if you could let me see it. Is it there?
Looking good, yep.
Okay. And it looks like my computer is frozen and I can't
Give it a minute. we wait to come back? Ruby, are you able to present first?
Yeah, absolutely. So I also want to extend my thanks for the invitation to be in the space with you all today. Oh, we lost. Okay. I wanted to also start with sharing that the craft emergency. Nana, are you back?
I'm here. Cheryl or Julie, do you have my presentation? It looks like when I try to screen share, it just crashes every time.
Give me 1 second. Let me go to the email.
Thank you. Thanks, Ruby, for buying time in the
Oh, yeah,
meantime.
yeah. So one of the things that I wanted to also mention, another organization that's really important in the disaster practice in the arts is the National Coalition for Arts Preparedness and Emergency Response. And they are an organizing body of both organizations that focus on disaster relief, recovery, response, mitigation, readiness for arts organizations, but then they also work with organizations that provide support for individual artists, organizations like the Craft Emergency Relief Fund. And then they also gather together national peers. So that's one of the connections that we've had with FEMA and HENTEF over the years as well. The steering committee is a small organizing body, and for the last 10 to 12 years, it's been a blossoming and scattered practice. I think a lot of folks that started early. So, Hurricane Katrina in 2005 really catalyzed a lot of the idea that disaster management in the arts is an actual practice. We were so excited, I want to say in 2017. Don't quote me on the date. We all celebrated that the first administrator with an actual title that included disaster response in a local arts agency was named and hired, and it was such a turning point. And over the years, there have been a lot of catalytic moments in the timeline that have caused policy change as a result of a happening or the result of a disaster, of a weather event. Oftentimes, we've seen additional resources being made possible. Most recently, the rule changes, I'm sure Nana will mention, through the individual assistance program is 20 years in the making. So the work has definitely been ongoing, but I do want to just bring them into the space while we're talking about it. Nana, Julie, Cheryl, do you want to flip to the, because that's it. I can pause or I can keep going and talk about CERF Plus.
Keep going.
Keep going. All
We're
right.
trying to troubleshoot here.
Okay. So to talk a little bit about the Craft Emergency Relief Fund, we're more commonly known as CERF Plus, the acronym, and the plus was added about, I want to say about 15, 20 years ago to denote the expansion of the work that we were doing. So we started out in 1985. We were organized by a group of individual craft artists who over the years had come to recognize that a common practice of and within the craft community, who were going to marketplaces, who were going to festivals, who were going to different shows, passing the hat in support of their fellow craft artists who were experiencing some kind of disruption, whether it was something happened in weather related during the event, or it was an emergency in their individual life that they were experiencing. They passed the hat, mutual aid, origin, and we've kept that spirit over the years. The organization has expanded past emergency relief. We now do readiness grants. Our readiness grants are currently $1,000. The deadlines happen twice a year. And these funds are available for individual craft artists to improve the safety of their work area or their studios, just wherever they're making their work. This has included personal protection equipment, so lots of masks during the pandemic, but it's also eye care, it's eye wash stations, it's ventilation, it's dust collection, it's fire extinguishers, but it's also documentation, it's also e-commerce, it's also their equipment to go to the marketplace. Are they getting a stronger tent to withstand weather events that might happen at outdoor events where they're selling their work? All of these activities happen, and these funds help offset those costs. We are actively working. We're hoping to increase them again over the next 3 years, recognizing that the grants aren't keeping up with the cost of certainly inflation in the wake of the pandemic. The other work that we do in addition to the readiness grants is our largest grant program, the Emergency Relief Fund. An emergency, not just defined as personal emergency, but the disaster relief work falls under those grant programs as well. So if you think about, flooding that happened in the Northeast late last year, if you think about, the hurricanes that are ongoing along the Gulf Coast, all of the activities that have been happening in Puerto Rico, we have been able to provide a lot of support. We also worked recently in Hawaii following the Lahaina wildfires. And all of that happens on demand. So if a weather system moves through, we can start processing applications immediately. Typically, we see participation 3 to 5 days are probably the earliest folks coming for support. Oftentimes it's disruption because they've been displaced or their work area has been affected. And then it's ongoing. We're still seeing the aftermath of the hurricanes in Puerto Rico from 2 years ago. Folks are still coming to the organization for support with, either tool replacement or, in some cases, it's alternate power systems to help because the power outages are ongoing and continue. So, because we're able to keep those on demand, we have a pretty well-oiled machine. We can turn around a grant request. If everything's in place, the person is eligible, we have all the documentation that we need in order to verify the situation. We can probably get that turned around in 10 business days and money out the door. We've been working with bill.com, so that allows us to do electronic transfer, not electronic, the ACH transfers. But we can also send checks, and we've been exploring some other kind of more immediate, mobile device friendly transfer systems to get the money out even faster. The other work that we do in relation to this practice is advocacy and research. So we have been one of the louder voices over the last 20 years that informed the FEMA rule change around individual assistance and eligibility. We are in conversation with FEMA as well around the operationalizing of the rule change. How is it working? Are the applications, navigable? Are there other questions coming up? Are we hearing about instances where folks are not able to get through the system? And all of that predicated on the disaster being federally declared. And so it is so important for organizations like ours to exist because we fill a space in between that when activation is hyperlocal in a small community, in a rural community, it isn't federally recognized. It doesn't get declared. There's still support structures that are available. And oftentimes we'll also do work at the local level in partnership with NCAPER, which I mentioned earlier, to provide information, to provide access, to provide support, to provide guidance. A lot of times we're having conversations with folks just to give them some information about, well, here's some really basic ways that you can collect and distribute resources or funding. Sometimes we'll get a donation from a local organization and we'll turn it right back around and help get that into the community, and then also try to work to leave capacity behind. And then, Yes, so those are the big ones. I didn't mention the emergency relief grants are $3,000. They have fluctuated over the years, but we're really working in celebration of our 40th anniversary next year to organize a reserve for the relief grant program that would allow us to maintain a $3,000 level uninterrupted, and then also give us resources to think differently about how we distribute funding, how we can be more responsive and be more timely and pointed. So looking at models like social service agencies where you submit an application and you just tick the things that you need and you get the support on the other side. We've also been looking at guaranteed basic income models. Is there an opportunity for us to build enough resources that we could distribute guaranteed basic income at a predetermined time point following a disaster? Because some of the things that we don't talk about is that the recovery process is the most nebulous of all of the moments of a disaster. Case in point, you look at the New Orleans area, they are still considered in recovery from Hurricane Katrina in 2005. It's going to be 20 years next year. And so just a classic example of the time it can take, the resources required, the stamina that's necessary to get through to the other side. And all of that is exacerbated by the ground point where the community started. So if the community didn't have sufficient infrastructure, didn't have sufficient resources, didn't have access to information or network, they're going to take that much longer to get to the other side of the recovery process. So I am going to stop there because I think that was a lot of information. Thank you.
Thank you for that. How are we? Slides ready?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay.
I can share Nana's slides. Let's do it.
Ooh. Okay, perfect. All right, thank you, Ruby, for your great presentation. And as I mentioned earlier, thank you for taking this time to learn about the Heritage Emergency National Task Force. I'll be referring to the task force as HENTEF to keep this presentation at a reasonable length. In this presentation, I'll provide a brief overview of HENTEF and our activities and programs. Next slide. So HENTEF is a public-private partnership sponsored by FEMA's Office of Environmental Planning and Historic Preservation, or OEHP, where I work, and the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative, or SCRI. Together, we advocate for the protection of cultural heritage. HENTEF's landing page is on the just newly updated SCRI website, and I'll be happy to share the links that I'm referring to later in the presentation. Our robust resources provide a wealth of information to help cultural stewards, emergency managers, and the public protect cultural and historic resources. Next slide. So HENTEF's objectives span the full emergency management continuum, engaging cultural stewards and emergency managers. During steady state, a term that is quickly becoming extinct as disasters occur with greater frequency, HENTEF provides disaster planning and preparedness resources and training. And when a disaster strikes, HENTEF is there to help states, tribes, territories, and local communities respond and recover. HENTEF also provides salvage guidance to disaster survivors at FEMA Disaster Recovery Centers, or DRCs. Next slide. We amplify our message of protecting cultural heritage through our 62 members. The 19 federal agencies are shown in red at the top. The 43 private nonprofit organizations are in black. Among its federal members are arts-related agencies such as the National Endowment for the Arts. HENTEF's non-federal members represent various sectors: the arts, culture, historic preservation, emergency management, and tribal interests. Among HENTEF's arts member organizations are, of course, CERF+, and the National Coalition for Arts Preparedness and Emergency Response, or NCAPER. Each private nonprofit member has a network of stakeholders, and the ability to push the information out to their constituents, mostly cultural institutions at the local level. And conversely, each has the ability to gather information, such as reports of damage, from their members and then pass them along to HENTF. HENTF can leverage this network to help you connect with and provide assistance to cultural institutions and arts organizations and artists at the local level. Next slide. Under the National Response Framework, HENTF supports Emergency Support Function 11, which is Agriculture and Natural Resources. Within the Department of the Interior, one of the partner agencies is the Office of Environmental Policy and Compliance, or OEPC. Again, lots of acronyms in the federal world, please bear with me. This office is charged with protecting natural and cultural resources and historic properties. HENTF works very closely with this DOI office. Next slide. Following a major disaster, HENTF coordinates the collection and sharing of incident-specific information with federal, state, regional, and local entities. These are HENTF's external stakeholders. When there's advance warning of an approaching event, such as a tropical storm or a hurricane, HENTF begins its outreach to these stakeholders, including the 62 HENTF members, FEMA Response and Recovery Leadership, state cultural agencies, the State Emergency Management Agency, state and regional archives, museums, arts and library associations, regional conservation and preservation centers, and the local or state cultural heritage emergency network, if there is one. State cultural agencies include the State Library, Archives, Museum, Arts Council, Humanities Council, State Historic Preservation Office, and Parks. In addition to the state agencies, there are state and regional associations, centers that provide preservation education and conservation treatment, and volunteer networks committed to assisting cultural institutions. HENTF can be alerted to damage suffered by the cultural or historic preservation community, but those cultural stewards need to connect with local, state, and federal resources. Next slide. HENTF is also a supporting organization of Natural and Cultural Resources Recovery Support Function of the National Disaster Recovery Framework. Here too, we work very closely with the same DOI office, the Office of Environmental Policy and Compliance. HENTF supports the NCR-RSF in developing recovery needs assessments by identifying issues, impacts, and unmet needs of private nonprofit cultural institutions. Next slide. Just last year, HENTF created 3 damage assessment forms to help quickly capture damage that has occurred following an event. We have a form for cultural institutions with an excerpt shown here. We also have a form for arts organizations and one for individual artists and performing groups. We're grateful to the Foundation for Advancement and Conservation, or FAIC, for hosting the data for cultural institutions. And we're grateful to the National Coalition for Arts Preparedness and Emergency Response, or NCAPER, for hosting the data for arts organizations and artists and performing groups. Our hope is that this form can become the standard way to collect reports of damage. We'll be tweaking it as they're employed following disasters, and we hope that we'll eventually be able to identify trends and unmet needs that cultural stewards and emergency managers can learn from and address. Next slide. Among our many recovery support function actions, we deliver technical assistance, guidance, and resources by drawing from the diverse expertise of our 62 members. These are photos of mission assignments coordinated with DOI, for which staff from federal HENTF members were deployed. In the left and middle photos, we see an assessment of US Virgin Islands legislative records badly damaged by Hurricane Irma. On the right, following Hurricane Maria, HENTF worked with 5 federal agencies, tapping subject matter experts at the Department of the Interior, the Smithsonian Institution, the National Archives and Records Administration, the National Park Service, and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to bring training in mold removal and health and safety to Puerto Rico's cultural stewards. Next slide. Public assistance is a FEMA funding program that can be triggered by a major disaster declaration. It's a program that helps private nonprofits and government agencies get back on their feet. PA is a very difficult program for cultural stewards to navigate, especially when they're trying to get their institution back to normal, not to mention reconstruct their own lives. Non-critical private nonprofits provide other essential social type services to the community. PNP arts organizations and cultural institutions may be eligible for PA. And with funding hard to come by under the best of circumstances, it's important that cultural stewards at least explore public assistance as a means to obtain some recovery funding. Yet very few of these organizations find their way to PA as an applicant, and even fewer end up as subrecipients. Many of these organizations are often small, aren't aware of PA, and even if they are aware, they may not have the staff or the bandwidth to navigate the process. Next slide. The Public Assistance Program and Policy Guide on the left is the reference for PA. Papa G, as we fondly refer to it at FEMA, includes references to the arts and culture community, but they are difficult to find. The Papa G is currently being revised, and a new version of a section dedicated to cultural institutions and arts organizations should be released within the next year or so. The graphic on the right shows just how complicated the process is. So I highly recommend that you become familiar with the PA process on blue sky days when you're not in the throes of a disaster, whether you're assisting an arts organization or your very own institution. Next slide. So I'll just touch a little briefly on the recent updates to the FEMA Individual Assistance Program. As of March 22nd of this year, there have been some promising updates on the FEMA IA Individual Assistance side. This is a fact sheet available online with an overview of the 3 areas that have been improved by the updates. I'm by no means a technical expert on this, but just wanted to highlight a few areas that apply to the cultural and arts communities. These changes are meant to establish new benefits for individuals to cut out some of the bureaucracy and red tape, and to expand eligibility and to make the application process simpler and more equitable. Next slide. So standardizing serious needs assistance and creating displacement assistance are eligible for everyone. We encourage individual artists, cultural workers, and creatives to pursue these opportunities. Next slide. The 2 highlighted are the biggest changes. The first is simplifying other needs assistance, and as it says, FEMA will no longer require survivors to apply for a Small Business Administration SBA loan before applying for FEMA assistance. This is very off-putting for artists and creatives, and frankly, everyone who didn't want an obligatory situation that was difficult to fully understand. This opens the door and makes the application process a little less intimidating. Simplifying assistance for entrepreneurs is where now if you're a self-employed worker, you have access to support to replace your critical tools to return to work. Items such as paintbrushes and musical instruments are now recognized as tools that are essential to return to work and are eligible for support. Next slide. Simplifying the process for appeals keeps the doors open for people to learn and understand the changes. As people work through these processes, this allows people to understand and be able to ask what they think they deserve under these revised rules and regulations. Next slide. When HENTF is not in the midst of addressing a disaster, we train cultural stewards and emergency managers. In Heritage Emergency and Response Training, or HEART, as we fondly call it, we help cultural stewards better understand what emergency managers do when disaster strikes, and help emergency managers better understand what cultural stewards do when disaster strikes. We train them on how to work together to protect the irreplaceable objects that bring meaning and understanding to their community. We completed HEART 2023 last December in DC at the Smithsonian Institution. The 25 participants included librarians, archivists, museum curators, fire service personnel, a state recovery officer, and fire chiefs and emergency managers from large and small cities. Sessions covered damage assessment, emergency documentation, rehousing and storage, creating and maintaining a strong disaster plan, team building, and more. In addition to tutorials and lectures, we have group discussions, group work, and practical exercises. The biggest exercise is an evacuation exercise where participants must physically and safely move items out of harm's way in a pretend museum, documenting where these objects come from and where they're going. After completing their training, participants are ready to support measures to protect cultural heritage in their own organizations and in their communities. We plan to offer HEART again in December this year, and I encourage you to take a look at the application information, which should be coming out on the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative website in September. Next slide. HENTEF informs and guides the public to help individuals and families protect, stabilize, and recover treasured possessions before, during, and after a water event. The Save Your Family Treasures program, or SIFT, began in 2016 as a collaboration between the Smithsonian Institution and FEMA. By bringing SIFT specialists to regions affected by disasters, assistance is provided to survivors by offering tips and techniques on how to salvage family heirlooms and treasures after they have suffered damage. In this context, salvaging means taking several steps to properly stabilize the heirloom or object to prevent more damage and reduce the overall loss of material. By providing this information, survivors can hold on to and preserve their precious family keepsakes. Next slide. HENTEF has been offering this program to a few FEMA disaster recovery centers, beginning with 2 DRCs in Baton Rouge following the flooding in 2016 through flooding events that occurred last year. What you see here are some setups from deployments to Kentucky and Florida. Next slide. At the DRCs, demonstrators share tips on protecting items from future damage and offer takeaway fact sheets like those shown here. They're available for download from HENTEF's page in FEMA.gov. Next slide. I think it's the final slide. Yep. So with that, I hope that we can build collaborations and partnerships to protect cultural heritage in our nation's states, tribes, territories, and local communities from the damaging effects of natural disasters and other emergencies. And so thank you for your time. And back to Ethan.
Thank you for those. As I said, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. You can also raise your hand and ask the question verbally if you would like. I'll be looking for those, and I'll just kick it off with something that I think about a lot. You know, working in New Orleans, as you mentioned, Ruby is still in recovery mode. Post Katrina, 20 years on, and certainly we've had a number of other disasters. I mean, certainly globally COVID, but individually and locally, storms and other things that have hit here. And one thing that I'm thinking through a lot down here is the issues of equity and recovery. You know, New Orleans, the report just came out that there is just a huge racial wealth gap. The white families have 13 times the wealth of Black families on average down here, and so much of culture in New Orleans happens in often what would be non-traditional cultural spaces, right? It happens in corner bar rooms, it happens in people's homes, and a lot of those are also in working class Black neighborhoods. And so when you think about access to resources and what that means for places, I'm just curious where, you know, some thoughts y'all might have in terms of how we can really intentionally build equity into this recovery process and make sure that these non-traditional spaces may be, you know, and sometimes made whole as much as possible, as much as any larger institution may be, you know, a large museum, et cetera. How can we greater build equity in both in a micro level and in a macro level, right? Individual, but also on a much larger. I know that's kind of a large question, but I'll be interested in any thoughts on that.
So we've been thinking about that too, right? That we know that when an event happens, it's going to have a disproportionate effect on folks that are already under-resourced, intentionally and otherwise. And for us, one of the things that we've been thinking about, as I mentioned, is this idea of guaranteed basic income. And how can we aggregate the support that's available to respond to the things that people need? We're not first on the ground. We're usually like, once they've gotten to shelter, they've gotten stabilized to the extent that they can. But really, you know, I think when you think about the life cycle of a disaster, readiness and recovery are the least participated in my observation. And I think it's because it's the hardest ones to get your head around, that how do you, and to what extent are we responsible for making someone whole? When you lose your entire house, right? You lose your property, you lose your equipment, you lose everything. And how much of a better job can we do at the front end around readiness? That do folks have the right amount of insurance that if things happen, they're going to get at least some replacement value? Are people informed on where to go, what to do? Do they have the documentation they need? Because I think that's part of it, is that, you often hear what, house rich, cash poor. If people are in houses, how are we providing those resources? We've also been thinking about things like preventative care. We know that we get a large number of claims from individuals who have dental issues that are now emergency issues that really, 2 years ago would have been preventative care, but they didn't have access to insurance. So can we, instead of, providing emergency relief, can we build a second program that provides dental insurance premiums for a year to get folks in, and then an additional subsidy to have them do whatever immediate work they need done? Is that going to save us, right? So you think about the way that healthcare has been responsive in some areas around this non-traditional preventative care support. How does that look in disaster areas? The idea too that we don't talk about the cyclical nature of a lot of these weather-related events, that that it's going to happen. And so what can we do to get ahead of it? What are the things that we know are still happening? We were talking with a company that produces saltwater powered power cells. They look like little bricks. You pour salt in it, you pour water in it, you put the cap on it, and you can power. It has a light built in, and you can charge 2 phones. And then when it peters out, you put more salt, put more water, keep going. And I'm like, what if we bought a bunch of those? And when people are in the get ready process, they can say, yes, I'd love an alternate power source. Off it goes. Or why aren't we doing ahead of, hurricane season, window treatments? I mean, like, what are the things that we know people need, that if we can get it into their hands ahead of time, we can mitigate the effect of something happening? Because certainly you can't get it to zero. That's the other part, right? So in the recovery process, equity building, when we think about getting folks ahead of it, because you're just rebuilding for years in some cases. So if we can do guaranteed basic income in the wake of a disaster event, at some, future moment, it just activates and you get it. That's going to give you an opportunity to build some equity, because you're not using your existing resources to try to also build a foundation. You're getting the extra to try to build that. And a lot of folks we know use that to help offset expenses, to either gain access to better things that they need. And if possible, they're putting some of that in their savings. So we know that it builds at least incremental equity, right?
I think that's great. And I know one thing I heard in that answer too was listening to community, right? The community themselves know what they need, or what the resources are. And so getting in front of that before the disaster can really help on the back end, right? Organizationally, something we've been thinking about a lot is, we can't solve the affordable housing crisis ourselves, right? But there's a lot of people working on it, and we haven't made much headway down here. But what we can do is get in front of what I always think are like the minor that become cascading disasters for folks. Is someone's having, there's a electricity bill that's hundreds of dollars and they can't figure it out. Their electricity is going to get shut off, which can then lead to another issue, which leads to another issue, which then becomes a financial crisis. Or someone's car breaks down, they can't get to their gig, they can't get to work, and suddenly they have no ability to make money, they can't make their rent. So how do we get ahead of these cascading disasters that, again, we can't create a new affordable home necessarily, but we can maybe stop someone from losing their home just because of one disaster leads to another. So I really like the idea of kind of thinking through what that prevention looks like. But Nana, one thing you talked about in your presentation too was the family heirloom program. I'm interested in kind of that one. How do you decide, or how is it the decision made where that program is implemented, but also how does it work for someone that would be interested in being a part of that program?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I second everything that Ruby has said in terms of the equity piece as well. The challenge really is making sure that our information and resources are reaching the right audiences and the right people. And we always want to ensure that our programs and resources are not the parachute type where we just kind of dump them on the community and leave, but that they're actually empowering the community to be able to safeguard and maintain their own cultural heritage moving forward. So with the Save Your Family Treasures program, primarily, we staff the FEMA Disaster Recovery Center since that's kind of our easiest access to the public through FEMA programs. But we're also always open to having demonstrators at whatever sites the community may deem of value, whether it's the local library or arts organization or wherever. So we're open to having demonstrators present where needed. And then all of our online resources, fact sheets and things like that are available online. The demonstrations are not necessarily available for every single disaster, but we are working to expand capacity to be able to deploy a variety of FEMA staff, but also subject matter experts from our member agencies, for example, and building that capacity. So we do hope to see an increase in Save Your Family Treasures presence moving forward and being able to staff more disasters more equitably, which is something that we've been struggling with a fairly small staff, but working to build that capacity. So as far as how can people get involved, yeah, especially those of you, who have kind of influential power at a cultural institution or arts organization, for example, we're always open to collaborating and working with your staff and sharing the resources and that sort of thing. Because really, this is not like secretive information or anything along those lines. Like we'd like, for community members to be able to assist their counterparts in salvaging family heirlooms. And these are tips and techniques that are pretty easily able to be picked up, and they use items that are able to be purchased at a hardware store. So we try to make it accessible and something that everyone can do in an emergency situation.
Great, thank you. All right. As I keep looking at, another thing that I've thought about a lot within the context of this work, and it is something we touched on, I think maybe in the pre-panel discussion, which is sort of the definition of what a disaster and what a need can be, right? Because it can be so wide ranging. Does that mean what is a disaster, but also what is in some sense what can resolve that for an individual, right? And how do you meet that need? The challenge with that is that the guidelines are so broad it can be difficult. There's a lot of gray area, and I'm curious for both. How do you work with that gray area to determine who might qualify, who might not? Is there a cutoff? How do you it's not an easy question, right? But how do you work with that in your agencies?
Yeah, I'm happy to kick off. With federal funding, for example, FEMA assistance, HENTF really, has no power, unfortunately, in terms of, who is eligible and able to receive that assistance. But as you mentioned, yeah, disaster could be, a pipe leak in a museum, and it's a disaster for that institution, even if it's not impacting the rest of the county or city at all. And in those instances, we do try to offer technical assistance. So we work closely with the Foundation for Advancement and Conservation and their National Heritage Responders. So they have a 24/7 hotline with conservators on call who are available to provide guidance. And so that's how we try to at least provide some assistance to those gray area cases that aren't in a position to be able to receive federal assistance for the time being, or even in the interim while waiting for a disaster to be federally approved. That's kind of the golden hour when you can save those collection items. So we do our best to try to offer technical assistance and guidance at the very least to try to address institutions and individuals in need as quickly as possible.
So for the program that we run, it starts with, are you a craft artist? And so it's kind of, we have committed in our strategic pillars to be generous and inclusive. And so that drives our ability to be as expansive in the definition of a craft artist and what craft is. And then is it an eligible event? And so a lot of times, in our recent annual report, we talked about how disaster and emergency are not the same thing. And when you think about disaster, it's much more of this large, as the practice organizes it, right? That it's much more of this large scale, community wide, episodic, typically a weather event or some type of, landscape, something. And emergencies are that, right? My car got stolen, my house is on fire, my studio flooded. Because even a flood isn't always going to happen because of a climate event, right? Sometimes it's going to happen because a water hose broke and now you've got 6 inches of water in your basement where all of your work is. And so we really try to define emergency pretty broadly as well. Typically we look at it as something unanticipated and something that is very immediate. For us, it also has to disrupt your practice because we focus on craft artists. But those seem fairly logical. If you're a craft artist and the work is as close as we can get it to it, we ask a lot of questions if it's not, just to try to see what we can do. And then as long as the disaster or emergency situation qualifies. We also have a pretty short list of things that don't qualify. So like, regular maintenance issues, things like that typically are not eligible. But again, where do we go with this idea of readiness and preventative? And if we can make that investment, is it going to shift the way that we look at all of it? And by and large, I think the definition of disaster in general has gotten very broad when you think about situations that have happened at mass gatherings and some of the civil unrest that's happened and things like that. Oh, Julie. Can I explain what comprises a craft artist? No, not succinctly. I will put a link to our grant guidelines, and that's as close as we get to a definition, because it really shows up sometimes, regularly in ways that we hadn't thought about it. And so typically it's, object work. You produce a thing that's tangible. It could be foundational or functional. It could be, abstract or yeah. So I really try not to. I typically say yes and smile because I think that's exactly what it is, right? And then you have the added layer of complicatedness when you think about technology and how 3D printing is moving into the space and how that is allowing artists who, for example, there's an amazing ceramicist who is using an extruder in a 3D printer to 3D print their work. It's stunning. I can't fight me if you want to tell me that's not craft, that's how I feel about it, but it gives people feelings. And so we really try to hold that space for folks, that maybe we don't resonate with it, or maybe we individually. I always remind folks, like, it's not about us, it's about the work, and the work doesn't have to make you feel any kind, like, you don't have to like it in order for it to be eligible work.
I think that also really encapsulates a lot of the challenges between arts and planning, right? Is that in the planning field, there's this, you want to be able to define everything, kind of put it in a box and figure out right rules and regulations, et cetera. And in the artistic space, it's the opposite, right? And so when we try to both do it regular planning, but particularly in disaster relief, recovery, prevention, it really does become a challenge to figure out who can qualify for what, particularly when it might be a life-changing need, right? Because you don't want to tell anybody no. You want to have it as broad as possible. Bureaucracy can be difficult to do, but you try to figure out a way to make it work and to expand that outward as well. But it is a real tension, and it's I think people grappling with it, but I think there's no way it never won't be to some extent, right? And it's just it's kind of the nature of the beast, but it's to create enough flexibility within systems that allow it to move when it needs to. I'm just looking through if there aren't other questions from the crowd. I'm interested. What do you see as sort of the biggest emerging challenge, but also I'm interested in what you think a big success, or at least a success would be. So we don't have to just focus on negative or positive, but I'm interested.
That's a tricky question. Starting with the challenge, I think, is really the networking piece. In other words, like connecting the federal resources to the local level continues to be an ongoing challenge where, we have this robust network of federal and private nonprofit resources available and all these subject matter experts from various organizations, but making that connection from the federal level to folks on the ground continues to be a challenge. And we leverage our membership to, get the word out and messaging out, but then there's still this kind of piece missing, as far as reaching the individuals through an avenue that they trust, whether it's a local arts organization or cultural institution. So I think continuing to build that network and strengthening local capacity is the biggest challenge, and something that I hope to improve over the coming years as HENTF capacity expands. And one of the biggest successes, well, yeah, I mean, we're seeing, more and more institutions and even individuals with the new IA regulatory updates reaching out to us and reporting their damage and seeking assistance, and seeing, the individuals taking that initiative has been really inspiring. Where in the past, we send out all these resources and information, and it just kind of seems to go out into the ether. But there is some level of improvement from, hearing from the actual ground level. And I think that's in big part thanks to a lot of the state and local level organizations who are taking the initiative to share our information and get it out there. And individuals are more apt to respond to those sources, because they're more trusted and closer to the ground. And we certainly appreciate that connection. So I think it's a both negative and a positive, of two sides of the same coin, I'd say.
Yeah, I would say a challenge that I've seen has really been around the gaps that there are not like organizations like us for other artistic disciplines that are as specific as we are. And because of that, we see the distance, right? That like a visual artist, a photographer can't come to us for support. And there's really no other organization for them like us. They can go to the state, they can go to the county, they can go to the local, they can go to the community foundation. Oftentimes, even folks like yourself, Ethan, that the community itself is coming together to try to figure out how to be supportive, which is just another draw on resources. So not to say that there should be more organizations like us, but I think being cognizant of where those gaps exist is the opportunity. That how do we think differently about the way that response and relief is funded and organized, could change everything about how we're looking at this work in 10 years. I think the success that we've had, what could it look like? Oh my gosh, if more people had wills, if more people had a regular safety protocol that they practiced, all these fancy like words. If you just walk around your house and make sure that things that look loose are tied down, that would be great. Like that is an amazing start. So when you think about that in regards to planning, how are we looking at the built environment to withstand and be able to weather? Like, are you inadvertently putting things that could eventually be a projectile in the event of a storm? Are you putting things that have a dual purpose that could be a shelter and a protection in the event of a weather system? I think there's a lot of opportunities that we have to be more thoughtful about the way that we're organizing, and not just in documentation or, structural, but in the way that we're thinking about the way that people use spaces. And so I think there's a lot of, the big win that we've had is the FEMA rule change. But it's not done. We're never done. So, I celebrate the little ones, the big ones. Every artist that attends a workshop is a win. because they walk away thinking differently about their work, their home, their safety. And that's it. That's what we're trying to do. If we can get folks to think about it.
No, thank you. And I'll say there should be more organizations like y'all, right? It would be incredibly helpful. I know we're almost at time. I think just from a hyper local perspective down here, I think the biggest challenge we're seeing is the growing housing insurance crisis. That's happening in other states as well. It's happening in Florida. It's going to happen many other places, and I think that's putting tremendous stress, and certainly within the cultural space, because so many folks there are often living on sort of if not paycheck to paycheck, commission to commission, et cetera, and so are hitting that challenge. I think that's probably for another APA session, another in another space, but certainly the cultural space needs to be a part of it. One success that I've seen growing over the past 4 or 5 years is the growth in mutual aid as well, which again is sort of the hyper local solution to a lot of these things of community helping community, setting up community fridges, doing all these things that are starting to meet some of those basic needs that an outside entity or government may not be able to do, but some little bits of support can really help move that along so the bigger issues can get tackled. I would kind of put those both out there as trends, good and bad, to watch. But before we go, I just want to thank you both for being in this space. Thank you for the discussion. I know there's a lot of information in the chat on how to follow up. I know this is recorded as well, so certainly we will be sending some folks your way for information and questions. And for those that are in attendance, we do these sessions, if not monthly, at least bi-monthly. So please follow up, see where the next session and what the next session will be. We also have periodic meetings as well for the Arts and Planning Division. So I'd encourage folks that may not be members to please join and be a part of the work and the discussions as well. Julie, Cheryl, if you have anything to add before we end, now.
No, just a thank you to our speakers and for all of our attendees.
Thank you.
Y'all have a